Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our second Bush Broadcast Autumn webinar, bringing native fish back to our rivers, which we're holding in celebration of World Fish Migration Day. I'm Elizabeth McClellan. I'm the head of region of the Southeast region for Bush Heritage Australia, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this webinar today. Firstly, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm working at the moment, and that's Southern Yamatji country in Jambanoo or Geraldton over on the west coast. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the places where all of our participants are joining from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. So I see we've got quite a lot of people on the webinar today, which is fantastic. Would you please introduce yourself in the chat with your name and where you're joining us from, and that'll enable us to understand who's with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. It's a little bit different to previous Bush Broadcast webinars in that we have some special guests who will be presenting about a wonderful project carried out in partnership with Bush Heritage. And for this webinar, we welcome Bush Heritage supporters, friends of the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach Partnership, and those who have joined us thanks to the World Fish Migration Day campaign. You'll be able to ask questions along the way, so please add these to the chat function and we'll come to them after all of our guests have presented. We're going to be discussing work today undertaken by the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach, of which Bush Heritage is the lead partner, in partnership with University of Canberra and the New South Wales Government's Department of Planning and Environment to support healthy rivers and the species that rely on them. Within Australia's Great Murray-Darling Basin, native fish populations are currently estimated to be about 10% of pre-European settlement numbers. Macquarie perch, also fondly called the macca, is one such species that is currently endangered. The macca was once abundant and widespread throughout the southeast Australian rivers. However, they're now fighting for their survival with serious implications for Australia's freshwater biodiversity. Australia-wide, only a handful of self-sustaining wild macca populations remain in isolated and disconnected waterways. So successfully completing their annual spawning run to access breeding habitat is key to the ongoing survival of this species. A waterway that we are working hard to restore is the Upper Murrumbidgee River. It's wrapped around our Scottsdale Reserve's northern and western flanks, and the Bidgee cascades over natural rock weirs and through deep tree-fringed pools, and it is a national stronghold for the macca species. The Upper Murrumbidgee River is unfortunately a highly modified catchment, or it's fortunately, unfortunately, depending on perspective, with a history of aquatic and riparian habitat impacts due to land use practices and changes. One of the biggest threats is the Tantangara Dam, which diverts 90% of the flows from the Upper Murrumbidgee River as part of the Snowy Scheme, changing the natural flow regime, which previously raged with snowmelt, cleaning the macca's breeding habitat in preparation for the spawning runs in spring. The higher flows enabled the macca to move freely into steep and rocky gorges, which contain the spawning sites. So a key priority with these changed flows is for flow managers and scientists to ensure that environmental flow releases do help to clean the breeding habitat and ensure that the annual spawning runs can be completed. So today we're going to have speakers talking about some exciting work that addresses this issue. And this will be talking about work undertaken to assess natural barriers and assist with environmental flow planning for Macquarie perch spawning migrations. So I'd firstly like to introduce you to our speakers. We have the facilitator with the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach, Antia Bradman. Welcome, Antia. We have from the Environmental Water Management Office, officer with the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment, Emma Wilson. Hi, Emma. We have Associate Professor at the University of Canberra, Dr. Mark Lintemans. Thanks for joining us, Mark. We have a Senior Aquatic Ecologist also at the University of Canberra, Ben Broadhurst. Welcome, Ben. And finally, we have Associate Professor also at the University of Canberra, Dr. Dwayne White. Thanks for joining us, Dwayne. So now I'm going to hand over to our first presenter, Antia, and from Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach. She's going to talk about the native fish recovery strategy and how this work fits with our landscape scale conservation work for the Murrumbidgee. Over to you, Antia.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you kindly, Liz. Thank you for joining our webinar today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and the Ngurrugu people, who are the traditional custodians of the country in which the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach partners live and work. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are joining us today. I won't keep you because the exciting part of this webinar is with the experts, but the project you will hear about today has come about thanks to a collaborative effort by a range of partners and is guided by Professor Mark Lintemans, who also joins us today, who developed this project. The work that you will hear about today has been made possible by funding under the joint programs of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and their work with the Native Fish Recovery Strategy, the New South Wales Government's Department of Planning and Environment, and the Australian Government's Healthy Rivers Grant Program. Could we have the next slide, please, Megan? This work is supported by the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach Partnership under its objective to improve the health of the Upper Murrumbidgee for the wellbeing of native fish and for the wellbeing of our community. In the Upper Murrumbidgee, we have two nationally significant populations of native fish. We've got the Macquarie, which is found in the upper part of the Upper Murrumbidgee River, above Canberra, as you can see on the map. And we also have a nationally significant population of Murray cod, which are downstream, found in Canberra. As part of today, I'd like to acknowledge the key partners of the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach, which you can see the logos on the right-hand side, as well as those partners with whom we've been working with over the last few years. And I'd especially like to acknowledge Bush Heritage as the lead partner of the Upper Murrumbidgee Demonstration Reach. And thank you to Liz and the team for providing us the opportunity to showcase this work today. As I said, this project will benefit one of the last remaining populations of Macquarie perch. And you can see on the map, the Murrumbidgee River, the Upper Murrumbidgee River is in the southeasternmost part of the Murray-Darling Basin. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll hand over to Emma. Oh, I think you're on mute, Liz.
Hello, sorry about that. Emma is from the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment, and she's going to take us through the role of the department in supporting environmental flows in the Upper Murrumbidgee and the need for research into natural in-stream barriers. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you very much. And firstly, I'd just like to welcome everyone for your time today. And also a big thank you to Bush Heritage for organising this webinar. As Liz mentioned, I work for the environment. I'm an environmental water manager who works for New South Wales Government in the Department of Planning and Environment. I work with a small team that is responsible for managing environmental water for the Snowy and Montane rivers, which also includes the Upper Murrumbidgee River. We work quite closely with the Snowy Advisory Committee, which consists of both government and also community members, and also other experts that help us to plan the delivery and also monitor environmental water releases into the Upper Murrumbidgee from Tantangra Dam. The water allocations we get for the Upper Murrumbidgee change annually and are subject to the previous year's rainfall and inflows into the various storages. And there isn't always enough water for us to provide daily releases from Tangatanga Dam into the Upper Murrumbidgee. So this essentially means that the flows we use to provide some of the natural flow seasonality and flow variability that you would typically see in a snowmelt montane river, but we can't do this every day. So what that means is that we have to prioritise our flows to support some of the ecological functions in these river systems, but we can't support everything. One of the key aims of environmental watering that we have is to help support Macquarie perch population. The Upper Murrumbidgee supports the largest of, I believe, only 3 remaining natural New South Wales populations of Macquarie perch. When there is sufficient water, environmental water available, we look to do high releases that are made in late winter and spring to help flush gravels and cobbles in preparation for breeding season and to provide clean substrate for the fish to lay their eggs. We're always looking for opportunities to increase our knowledge and understanding and the science behind that helps make best use of the environmental water available. One of the areas we're interested in is to improve our understanding in native fish migration and the barriers in the Upper Murrumbidgee River and how environmental water releases can be best managed to support fish movement. For example, what volumes of water are required to be released from the dam to drown out these barriers along the river to allow for fish passage at particular times of year for things such as spawning. Apologies to those if you can hear my little one in the background. She's home with me today with COVID. The Department of Planning and Environment is one of the funding partners for this exciting project that is being presented today, that's looking at mapping the natural fish barriers in the Upper Murrumbidgee, which I think is a critical first step to help us understand where these barriers are and what we can do for the Macquarie perch to give them the opportunities that they need to move to spawn. And it's a great collaborative project and lots of partners. So I'd like to thank all of those that have contributed. And we certainly haven't come up with the idea of this project. I believe that was Mark Linterman's. And yeah, it's really great to see this work underway. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emma. And yeah, it's a sign of our times, isn't it, that there's somebody in the background with needing to be home or with COVID. I hope she recovers well. So that was a great introduction to the complexity of the issues and the complexity of environmental flows. I'd like to hand the floor over now to Mark and Ben, Mark Lintermans and Ben. Mark is one of the leading experts on Macquarie perch, has been working on this species in the Upper Murrumbidgee for over 40 years. So Mark and Ben are going to tell us a bit about the biology of the Macquarie perch and the influence of in-stream barriers on spawning migrations and potentially range distribution. And I'll hand over to Mark first.
Thanks, Liz. I'll just try and share my screen here. What I'm going to try and do is give you a little bit of a background to Macquarie perch in the Upper Murrumbidgee. Okay, so Macquarie perch, Maccas, we're not talking about hamburgers here. They're now a fish of cool, clear upland streams, generally with intact riparian vegetation. The major threats to the species are fish passage issues, habitat degradation, sedimentation, alien species, and quite often the diseases and parasites that alien species carry. And they've been listed as endangered since about 1998. They're endangered both on national and international lists, and in all of the range states where they still occur, they're listed as extinct in South Australia. So I just want to give you a quick walkthrough about what we had in terms of Macquarie perch populations in the 1980s and 90s in the Upper Murrumbidgee catchment. So that's above Burrinjuck Dam. So we had a whole range of populations in Burrinjuck, Goodwood-Igby, Cotter Reservoir, little population in the Paddy's River, fish still in the Murrumbidgee in the ACT, the Queanbeyan River, there was a little translocated population there, and we had these sort of scattered records from sort of between the ACT and Cooma. And this is the decline of the ACT population in the ACT. And as you can see that in the early 80s, it crashed. And the thing that we don't know is what that first data point represented in terms of, you know, the virgin biomass of the species, i.e. we don't know how far they had declined when we first measured them in 1980. So they're now effectively undetectable in the Murrumbidgee River in the ACT. So what do we have now? Well, we still have the Cotter Reservoir population, which has expanded upstream, but we've lost about 5 other populations. And really what we're going to talk about today is this population in the very top of the Murrumbidgee below Tantanga. And it's the jewel in the crown. It's a self-sustaining population that occurs in about 80 to 90 kilometres of river. And when I say self-sustaining, it means that we can find these tiny little young of year. So it tells us that they are actively breeding there. And they breed there just about every year. Maccas have gone from part of the catchment. So you can see that the blue line is the self-sustaining population that goes from just below Cooma to just below Yoyak. They used to occur from Yoyak up as far as Tantanga Dam in the 1950s. They're gone from there now. Carp is invading this self-sustaining population, and they probably go a third or a half the way up the catchment there. And redfin are knocking on the door as they continue to be spread. So we need to know about barriers and how we can manage Macquarie perch in that catchment, and how we can manage alien fish as well.
Thanks very much, Mark, for that great introduction. I'd love to hand over to Ben Broadhurst now to continue our introduction to Macquarie perch.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Mark. And thanks, everybody, for the opportunity to come and speak on the day after World Fish Migration Day. So it's exciting times. Always exciting to speak about maccas. I've been working with this species, not quite as long as Mark. I think I did the tally up and I'm just a tick over 20 years. So we're getting there. So I'd just like to share my screen now as well. Hopefully this works. Okay, great. So why is connectivity important for Macquarie perch? Well, and fish in general for that matter. Well, it's essential for population maintenance. So connectivity establishes gene flow between individuals and populations, which is important for maintaining things like genetic diversity and reducing the likelihood of negative features such as inbreeding. Connectivity allows colonisation and recolonisation of habitats, and this is especially important around the edges of ranges and that sort of thing. So if a population gets removed for some reason by a drought or bushfire, it can actually re-establish populations back into those habitats. Critically, and probably most vital to the current topic of today, is it provides access to both mates and critical habitats. And in terms of Macquarie perch, this means clean riffles and run habitats for spawning. And this is undertaken in late spring and early summer. So when considering, and all of these put together gives us a resistant and resilient population. So a population that's robust against some, short-term stochastic events such as floods, bushfires, and that sort of thing. Today, I guess most of our attention will be drawn towards the upstream passage. Should connectivity break down, it actually renders these populations at risk of extinction, and Mark's example of how many of these populations have disappeared is a good example of this through lack of connectivity. So what does a barrier to Macquarie perch actually look like? Well, everyone, when you think of a barrier to fish movement, everyone's minds immediately jump to these sort of large dams and weirs that are dotted around the place. But there's also these smaller man-made features as well, such as road crossings, and here's one from the Cotter River. and another one from the Cotter River there. And these aren't traversable generally by our native fish. So trout can jump up and over these sort of barriers. Our introduced trout can jump over, but our native fish just can't get past these type of barriers. The focus of today is largely going to be around these natural in-stream barriers. So this is a rock bar in the Cotter River that actually forms a barrier against Macquarie perch movement, upstream movement during most of the time. And these features are dotted all around our upland streams where Macquarie perch are now prevalent. So what can we do about barriers? I guess one of the first examples would be to translocate. So we can actually move fish, collect fish from below a barrier and move them upstream of the barrier. An example of this was in, sorry, let's get my notes here. Googong Dam in the late 1970s was constructed on the Queanbeyan River. Macquarie perch were present in the reservoir, but monitoring indicated that there was no recruitment going on. And so some research was undertaken and they found that the newly inundated reservoir waters are actually abutting a large in-stream barrier, Curley's Falls. So they translocated 60 adults upstream of this Curley's Falls to try and establish a population up above where there's access to breeding habitat. In the short term, it looked like it was a little bit unsuccessful, and Mark sort of did all the monitoring around this, so he was probably shaking his head, I've got it all wrong, but as far as I could tell, it sort of took a little while and there was not really much encouragement, and then after a while that population actually started recruiting and they're picking up those little Macquarie perch that Mark showed a photo of before, and so it was a really good sign in the short term. So this population had established up above the reservoir, up above the barrier, and the population was starting to recruit itself. Unfortunately, the millennium drought hit and really decimated that population, and all indications are that that population is now extinct. So unfortunately, even though the translocation worked initially, over time, that lack of connectivity really paid parcel to that population being taken away. Our other options for barriers is we can remediate them. So we can either remove them or install a fishway. So one place where this has actually been quite successful is in the Cotter River, which is a tributary of the upper Murrumbidgee. In 2001, a fishway was installed on Benedict's Crossing, and I think you can see my cursor there, hopefully. And that's what the crossing looked like prior to the fishway going in. And then that's what the fishway looked like. It's a specially tailored fishway to Macquarie perch. It's called a rock ramp fishway. The gradient was reduced because they weren't sure that the current state of play of rock ramp fishways was sort of low enough gradient to allow Macquarie perch to get through. So specially tailored, it's got all sorts of features like resting pools and lots of little places they can tuck in behind the flow to get out of the flow. Early indications, early monitoring suggested that that fishway might not have worked. So there were fish below the fishway, but there were no Macquarie perch detected up above the fishway. I was involved in some snorkeling surveys of the Cotter River in 2006, and we actually detected some larvae up above, a few kilometres up above the fishway, which gave us the first indication that, yep, Macquarie perch had actually moved past this fishway and we're using it, and it actually spawned upstream, which was great. And we did some netting in the following couple of years in the autumn, and we actually determined there were multiple year classes present up above the fishway. And so this was great. So this population had not only moved upstream and spawned, but there were multiple year classes up there. So that was a great result, and that really opened up that the Cotter River from the restricted sort of 5 kilometres of river they had before to further up the catchment. And because of this success, a second fishway was installed about 14 kilometres upstream. And so this increased the connectivity of the river from around 1 kilometre or 5 kilometres up to 25 kilometres of riverine habitat. So really spread the risk of this population being vulnerable to stochastic events. And I guess targeting the remediation more towards what we're talking about today, and this is by drowning out these barriers with flow events. So another case study I'd like to draw your attention to, the establishment of Cotter Reservoir was going to inundate key spawning habitat of Macquarie perch as it rose, and they were a little bit worried that there wasn't going to be access to spawning sites, or they'd have to find access to alternate spawning sites as the reservoir filled. So a little bit akin to what happened in the Googong Queanbeyan River catchment. So we set about surveying some natural barriers along the 25 kilometres of stream upstream of the Cotter Reservoir. A subset of these barriers were monitored for remediation at different flow rates. So there was different releases from a reservoir upstream, and we're able to get out and monitor and to try and determine whether we think adult Macquarie perch would be able to pass these barriers under some flow releases from the reservoir upstream. We assessed these barriers using flow velocities and depths and flow typing, and that was based on some swimming speed estimates that Dan Stars had done on some of his research earlier. And we found that several of the key barriers right around that sort of inundation zone and just upstream of the full supply level of the enlarged Cotter Reservoir were actually theoretically mitigated by flow releases. So they met all the criteria that we'd set in terms of being able to pass adult Macquarie perch. And from that, we implemented a management plan that would provide access for Macquarie perch to spawning habitat. Spawning, it says, that's a typo there, to spawning habitat in the Cotter River. Just to sort of show you from a couple of maps on what I'm talking about. So this is the Cotter Dam prior to enlargement. Adult macas didn't really move very far. About 1 kilometre upstream was their key spawning reach. And this was sort of in the 2000s, right up until the reservoir started to fill. And there was solid recruitment of fish every year. So little baby fish detected in monitoring in the dam every year. This is the location of some major barriers. The red ones are large barriers that we determined weren't going to be mitigated by flow releases. The orange ones were possible ones, and then the green ones were ones that were likely to be mitigated with flow releases. And I'll just point out that the enlarged Cotter Reservoir full supply level is about here. So it's pretty critical that we were able to mitigate some of these barriers here to facilitate movement to spawning areas. As the reservoir filled, so from sort of 2013 to 2015, the supply level actually abutted some of these large barriers, and we, from that monitoring in the reservoir in the autumns following those spawning years, detected little or no recruitment at all. So our theory about some of these being barriers to accessing spawning habitat actually rang true. As the reservoir filled in 2016, the headwaters, seems to have moved there, sorry. The headwaters were flooded right up until these sort of green barriers, which we hypothesised would facilitate Macquarie perch passage under higher flow conditions released from the reservoir upstream. We actually had some adult macas tagged in the reservoir with acoustic electronic tags, and we had some listening stations upstream of each of these barriers to try and determine whether these adults would move up past these barriers to spawn. And in a good result, we found that yes, our tagged adult fish were moving upstream of these barriers. And then in the following autumn, when we did our monitoring in the reservoir, we actually found a strong year of recruitment from that cohort going through. So a really good result. And from that, we've got a plan to sort of try and limit the amount of time that the reservoir is within that sort of zone of red large barriers. And when it's up above that, then we can release flows to facilitate passage to spawning habitat into the Cotter River. So from this, we've sort of developed some keys to success. So we need to know to target our life stages and habitats that are critical. So in terms of Macquarie perch, it's adult spawning fish, and the habitat we want to get them to is into their spawning habitat, so clean riffles and runs. We want to remediate barriers that give you best bang for buck. So taking out a barrier that is 10 metres downstream of another barrier is probably not your best bet. The best bet is to try and link up the largest possible amount of habitat by removing the smallest amount of barriers. Timing is everything. So if we're looking to drown out barriers for spawning Macquarie perch, there's no point releasing that during winter or late summer when these fish aren't spawning. So we want to target those releases in spring and early summer. We need to monitor the outcomes so that then we can learn and revise and adapt. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. That was excellent, really fascinating to hear all about. So now I'm going to hand over to Dwayne for and another fascinating part of this puzzle. And Dwayne has been using light detection and ranging remote sensing, or LiDAR, and drone surveys for in-stream barrier assessments along the upper Murrumbidgee. So could you take us through your preliminary findings and the next steps, Dwayne, please?
Okay, hopefully you can see the screen there. Yeah. So, yeah, as you guys have heard so far, this is a project looking in the very upper part of the upper Murrumbidgee, trying to understand where the barriers are across the reach between Tantangara and click that on, and the junction with the Murrumbidgee River. So effectively from the area downstream the dam down to where we have a much larger tributary and inflow into the bottom part, and where Mark had mentioned before, this is where one of those key breeding habitats for Macquarie perch live. So it's about 150 kilometres of river all told when you add it all up, and starts off from a relatively small stream up high, increasing in flow as you go downstream as the tributaries come in through that. So there was a bunch of challenges associated with this one, particularly getting access to the river for understanding where those barriers may or may not be, but both in terms of getting through private landholders and the stakeholders involved with that, but also just generally the relatively gorgy country involved in there. So we used a variety of approaches to basically increase our capacity to do that. So one of the key things from my perspective as a geomorphologist of this that's unusual about the upper Murrumbidgee is its high elevation and its relatively moderate gradient. So the Murrumbidgee is draining a high plateau area of the Eastern Highlands in Southeast Australia. And unusually, instead of just dropping straight off that plateau, like many of the streams do, like the Snowy or a lot of the coastal streams, it runs along the grain of the country, and so the overall gradient of the river is relatively moderate. So it's still very much an upland river, but not as steep as some of those other ones, particularly like the Murray that are dropping straight off that and flowing directly west. Also, it's got a diverse range of precipitation sources, so you have a variety of different flow types and events in this system, which would be different to, for example, the ones on the western side of the range, which largely get the frontal-based rainfall. So that produces a variety of different characteristics that are a little bit unusual, and probably why we're seeing this habitat of Macquarie perch up in this stretch. So because it is an upland river, the stream is quite confined, and so you're not spreading out onto a large floodplain, and that produces quite a permanent flow because of those different rainfall events, but also a flow because of that gradient and that confinement, which is able to shift sediment throughout the system. So it's one that where we have had disturbance through agriculture or other generation of sediment, whether that's fire or other processes that have dumped sediment into the river. The confined nature and the relatively consistent gradient of that stream means that it's able to shift that further out of the system and maintain those habitats that Macquarie perch and other fish tend to like. So the question here really is whether or not, not so much whether that habitat exists for the fish to be there, but whether they can move around it. So whether we have any large features like this one on one of the tributaries on the Digby, where Macquarie perch won't be able to get up and around. So to do that, we took 3 approaches. The first one was the more remote sensing based approach, which gave us quite a detailed look on the ground of what the topography was like. Looking at basically a 2 by 2 meter pixel across that entire reach, and finding the low point along the stream along that reach. You can see where you have the steep sections basically, and identifying where those were along the entirety of the reach in terms of that LiDAR based topography. Also then vetting that with aerial imagery, basically to see whether or not you've got a rapid in those areas to make sure that the LiDAR was giving us the answer that we were looking for. And so a variety of different approaches and distances that you can measure that gradient across. And we looked at a collection of those on the ground to see which is the most appropriate. And that happened in 2 ways. So Firstly, it was going out to the community to try and get a sense of where existing knowledge was for where we may or may not have barriers across that fairly substantive reach through the kayaking and pack rafting communities, but also the landholders that border the river, where we had conversations with those guys to see where they thought some of those major barriers may or may not be. And then lastly, heading out onto the ground to vet those more remote sensing or community-based observations, looking at ground-based observations of barrier height, flow speed, complexity of flow, and then also generating high-resolution maps of some of those key areas through photogrammetry and LiDAR-based techniques to be able to map those at a centimetre scale. So looking across the data that we got from the reach, there is no really large barriers like that large waterfall that I showed on the Goody Digby, or that Ben talked about on the Upper Queanbeyan. So the good news there in the perspective of fish being able to move up and down the reach is that there is a possibility that fish can move across this entire section. So the biggest drops that we saw were slightly above a metre, like this one upstream of Jones's Creek on the right-hand side. And they certainly did fit the bill for the sort of natural barriers that Ben had seen on the Cotter in terms of the general size and confined flow and the flow velocities that we saw in those areas in terms of being several metres a second. However, it's also worth noting that even the largest barriers that we saw had quite a complex shape to them, and so they certainly weren't the sort of simple weir-based or weir-style barriers that you saw on the Cotter River in terms of Vanity's Crossing. But there's a substantive amount of complexity around the margins that at high flow have the potential to drown out and provide fish passage in those areas. But at the sort of 5 QMEX, which is a sort of standard low to medium flow where we did the surveys, there were certainly several of those larger barriers that were unlikely to get fish up through them at that sort of standard flow level. Looking at where these barriers are across the river, we found over 50 rapids that are greater than half a metre in height, so potential barriers depending on their characteristics, decreasing into the higher sort of levels. And you'll notice that they're scattered both along the larger part of the reach in terms of the smaller stuff. So there are there are riffles and runs across that entire stretch, with the exception of some of the flatter areas around Bolero or Yayak. But the larger barriers tended to be clustered downstream of Bolero and upstream of Yayak. And looking at the comparisons with geology and tectonics in the region, that seems to be confined to areas with very steep stream gradients. So with that high resolution topography was giving us the indication that we had basically the steepest areas, unsurprisingly, also with the areas where we had clusters of those larger barriers. And from a geomorphic and geological perspective, that looks to be primarily related to some of the more active faults that we have in the region. So particularly the Cotter Fault, which runs across the Murrumbidgee at Yayak and is uplifting the upstream component there and generating a steeper area there. And also potentially the Murrumbidgee Fault, which has been active on a longer timescale and may have generated this relative steepening, which heads now all the way back up to where the head cut is now back up at Bolero, and some of the other concentration of those larger barriers. So we've got a distribution which is both scattered across the region, but also confined to some local sites, which gives us a sense of where we may need to go look in terms of understanding how the fish are moving up and down through the river network, but also giving us an insight perhaps why, at least to one of the reasons why we're not seeing the macas up in the area above Yayak in the present day, and potentially what we might need to do to allow fish that are in the lower area to move up into those upper portions. The other thing that came out, particularly of the detailed surveys, was an understanding of the overall characteristics of those barriers. So it's not just the barrier height that's critical, as sort of Ben had mentioned before, but also the nature of the flow and the potential refuge for fish in those areas. So across the spectrum of different barrier types, we saw basically a range from things that are more weir-like, like this one here near Killarney, where we have a bedrock bar that goes across the entirety of the channel and produces something that is effectively a weir as far as fish go. So there's a relatively thin flow above the barrier or the rock bar, and also below, and quite a steep drop off. So that it's within the gradient of 75 centimeters or more has happened within the space of a metre or so. And there's not really anywhere around that barrier, certainly at low flow, that fish can move above it. And there are several locations like this one on the right-hand side, which were slightly more complicated and had potentially more options for fish to move, but still that same sort of barrier type. The other extreme is more of a barrier type, which I've been calling basically a boulder sieve, where instead of having bedrock in the base of the channel, it's a collection of scattered boulders, and can be quite complex in terms of the flow characteristics, and also the steps at which this happens. So there's many different passages for fish in and around these areas when you have the right sort of flow conditions. So I think these ones are much more amenable to remediation through changes in flow, partly because you've got a natural feature in the river that already looks a little bit like a fishway. So in general, it's likely to be too steep for fish to move through during those low and medium flow conditions. But as you start to build up the water level, particularly as you drowning out the water level downstream during high flow events, which tends to be what happens from the experience I've had kayaking around a lot of these features. You then build up options and alternatives for the fish to either get around the main part of the flow or go underneath through some of those flow beneath the boulders that may allow them to get in and around these complex passages. So where does that leave us? Well, I think the work really does demonstrate why this reach is one of the areas where we have a self-sustaining population of macas, in that it basically is the Goldilocks child for the geomorphology of the system. So it's steep enough to have lots of habitat, but not steep enough to stop them moving up and down in at least in a more natural range of flow, and that when we do have higher flow events, there is the possibility that these larger features are likely to drown out and allow fish to move up and down, which is both a good and a bad thing in terms of allowing macas to move up through the region and obviously downstream during those big events, but also something that we need to watch out for some of the more alien fish that are going to cause issues in those areas. So we're probably 3/4 of the way through the on-ground work in the program at the moment, in terms of the overall mapping of the barriers. So there's a little bit more work to do over the next couple of weeks to head up into the areas, particularly around Yayak, to map out some of those larger barriers up there. And from here moving on, the next questions really are, what do these things look like in terms of those higher flow events? So we're looking to head out into the region in the next 6 months when we have some relatively high flow events planned through the winter time and into the spring, to see what those things look like and understand the overall flow, the overall barrier heights during those flows, and whether there's enough complexity in the system to actually allow fish to move up around some of those steeper areas. But I think from there, the sort of work that Ben's done in the Cotter would be particularly useful to understand exactly where the fish are moving at a fine scale, to get a sense of which of the features really are the ones that are the critical ones that we need to worry about. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. That's really excellent. Incredible work that's going on by all of you collectively to assist the maca in its spawning and migration passages in the upper Murrumbidgee. I've got several questions here from people throughout the presentation, so I'm going to read through them and throw to the person I think might be able to answer it. If you can't answer it, throw it to another panelist, please. We might not have time to get through all of the questions. So rest assured, people, if you've asked questions and they don't get answered yet, we will be in touch with the answer to your question. So I'm going to just work through them. To start with, we had a question from Peter about the word Ben was using to describe the alterations to the barrier, and I believe that Mark answered that in the chat and said that they were fishways. But we have another question that relates to that, and that's regarding the design of the fishways. Were these used elsewhere in Australian rivers for migrating fish, or was the design used overseas and has been adapted to our Australian conditions? So maybe Ben or Mark could answer that.
I'll leave that one for Mark, who's probably got a broader understanding of the Australian landscape.
So fishways have been used in Australia for almost 100 years now, but for the first probably 70 or 80 years that they were used, they were based on designs from Europe and North America called salmonid fishways, and they were pretty unsuccessful because they had a very steep gradient that Australian fish generally could not negotiate. Macquarie perch are slightly lazy swimmers. They just sort of, hang around the bottom and think, shit, when's the elevator coming? And so we now design fishways for that particular species with an even gentler gradient than we would for other native species. So the one on Vanity's Crossing was a 1 in 30 gradient. So to get over that 1 metre barrier, we constructed 30 metres of fishways.
Thanks, Mark. Here's a question for Dwayne, and it is, what is the LiDAR technique and the other technique you mentioned just before LiDAR? Dwayne, maybe you could just go into a brief detail there.
So the LiDAR technique primarily is basically a light detection and ranging. So it's like radar, but using light. Where you send out a pulse of light and it hits something and it bounces back at you. And so you can use that if you know the position of the thing that you're sending out to get basically a map of the topography of the area that you're trying to look at. And so there's now been work done across the entirety of the state to basically map out the surface of the land, basically the landscape at high resolution. And by high resolution, I mean, at a sort of 4 by 4 metre pixel across most of the state, getting down to 1 by 1 metres in areas like the ACT, where we've had a bit more work done. And so it gives us a really good understanding of what the topography and the landforms are across the region. The other technique, which is photogrammetry, which is a more of traditional approaches where you're using overlapping photos to basically get stereo vision to get a sense of what the height of the landscape is. And both of those have their strengths and benefits in understanding basically topography or structural characteristics of the landscape.
Thanks, Dwayne. A question about fires, given the awful summers, awful black summer fires a while ago. What is known about the impact of hot bushfires on Macca's habitat? Maybe Mark, that's for you, or Ben?
Yep, fire doesn't do great favours to any fish, particularly fish that lay eggs on the bottom, like Macquarie perch do. So in the Cotter River after the fires, the actual fire doesn't affect the fish, it's the rainfall after a fire. And that totally overwhelms streams with sediment and silt and ash supply. So in the Cotter River, we had some pools that were greater than 1.5 metres deep before the fire, and they had 1.4 metres of sediment, coarse sand and silt went into the stream. And so I'm monitoring that sort of impact. And we're now 2 years on from the fires, and we've still got over 0.5 metre of sediment in the streams. So when the pools fill up with sediment, fish lose their summer refuges from high water temperatures, And you also get spawning beds inundated with silt, and your food supplies, the aquatic bugs, get inundated with silt. So it's not great. And we lost a Macquarie perch population in Manus Creek effectively due to the bushfires. And so there were so few fish left there that we have had to stock it now.
Thanks, Mark. Sad news. Yeah, the fires were truly awful. Another question here, which is interesting, is what is the best guess of the natural flows from rain and snowmelt during spawning time without the dam? And would mimicking those offer solutions to fish passage? And I guess related to that is there possibility to control the release from upstream dams to facilitate the fish movement? So do we know what it might have been without the dams? And is that what we're trying to do with releasing water at strategic times?
I can probably answer part of that question. So the way it works for the Taintanga releases into the upper Murrumbidgee is we get given an allocation that effectively that we then have to plan for and implement for the following 12 months. So I guess we don't have a lot of flexibility there in terms of adapting in real time to what's happening on the ground. So what we tend to do is look at historical gauge data from flows that have occurred in the upper Murrumbidgee River. There's a gauge above Taintanga Dam. So we look at the historical data, and then what we do is base our releases for a year. We look at sort of what allocation we've got, and even though it is sort of around 10%, I guess, of what natural flows would have been, that's what we try and base our flows on for in a particular year. But when we have higher allocations, because I mentioned earlier that our allocations vary from year to year depending on how wet it's been. When we have higher allocations, what we do is actually put these peak flows in, add them in to try and help clean rivers in time that best suit Macquarie perch to move and spawn.
Thanks, Emma. And I've got a follow-on question from that. Is there somewhere that equates volume releases from Taintanga with a change in river depth at specific sites?
Oh, I don't know if I can answer that one. Sorry, Mark's shaking his head.
No.
I don't know, through Dwayne's work that he's just done, he might have a comment.
It's possible to model, but it's a non-trivial thing to do across a reach of that length.
Great,
Thank
answer. You. Cool. Actually, as a related flow question is, there have been high flows throughout 2022. Have you been able to monitor migration passage of the macas this season, given these high flows? Mark.
we haven't been able to monitor fish migrations because we don't really have tagged fish in the river in this reach at the moment. But one of the things that we have been able to monitor is the effect of those high flows on Macquarie perch breeding in 2021. And the monitoring that I did earlier this year showed that we had a really poor breeding season last year. And that again highlights the importance of the timing of flows that you release. So basically we've had, really high flows in the river during the spawning season and immediately after the spawning season. And so that has disturbed spawning beds. It's washed eggs away or damaged them, or damaged larvae, that can't swim very well after they hatch. So it just goes to show that, if we want to enhance Macquarie perch populations, we release flows before the eggs are on the ground to assist fish to get over the barriers before they spawn. And then we don't have high flows for a month or so after that, so that we're not damaging eggs and larvae.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I have a question here about what's the combined effect on the perch from trout, redfin and carp, please.
You want to take that one, Ben?
can make a start, and Mark, feel free to jump in on that. They've all got their own sort of potential impacts. I guess the most sort of instantly devastating one is the disease that redfin are a known vector for, the EHN virus. I won't attempt to try and spew out the long name for it, but it's a virus that that redfin perch are a vector for, and it's got a really high mortality rate when it comes in contact with Macquarie perch. So having those two species together based around that virus transmission is not a great result. Trout thought and have been shown to predate upon Macquarie perch. They also have a large dietary overlap with Macquarie perch as well. So they'd be competing for a lot of the same resources. In terms of carp, I mean, there's probably some generic ones there where carp mooch around potential spawning sites of Macquarie perch, but there might be the potential there for some egg predation. Changes in water quality and clarity associated with carp activity might affect some of the I guess hunting performance of Macquarie perch as visual predators, and also might increase some of the siltation of spawning habitats. Mark, you want to jump into some other impacts?
So the other impact of carp probably is that they are the major host for a parasitic copepod, a thing called anchorworm or lernia, and it looks like a little bit of green cotton thread that you'll see hanging off fish. And so basically this is a parasite that just burrows in. It has a head like a hammerhead shark, burrows into the skin and gets a lift with other fish species. And when that parasite drops off, it leaves a wound. And so that wound can then get infected with fungus and things like that. This parasite tends to burrow into the softest spots that it can get. And so that tends to be fins. And so for tiny little young of year Macquarie perch, if you have these parasites burrowing in to the tail fin in particular, it's the tail fin that allows fish to swim well. And so you've severely compromised their swimming speed. And so then you open them up to being caught by predatory things like trout or redfin or things like that. So there's a whole raft of sometimes what appear like minor impacts, but when you add them all together, they can be quite significant.
Thanks, Mark. I don't want to end on a note of impacts from introduced invasive fish, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Mark, maybe you have to just wheel your traveling macca past your screen just to give everyone a hope that the work is going to help the maccas in its migration and enable it to have the kind of wheels that the little fish has there that Mark has got. There's a number of other questions, all fantastic questions that I'm afraid we're going to run out of time to get to. So rest assured that we will give those questions to our panelists and you will get your answers back. And of course, this will be available as a recording for you to watch later or for people who are unable to attend. So I'd love to thank all of our panelists for taking the time. Thank you, Antia, Emma, Mark, Ben, and Dwayne for taking the time to explain this topic to us. And we wish you all the best for your future work and for the future of the maccas. And thank you to everybody who has joined in today and listened. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. And you go out there with renewed respect for maccas and for its needs in the environment and what all of these people are and others are tirelessly doing to protect it and preserve it in the landscape into the future. And that's why we're involved as Bush Heritage, looking after, trying to help country to be healthy and a long way into the future. So thank you everybody for attending and enjoy the rest of your day and goodbye from us all here.